The moment I saw my sister Cassandra walking down the aisle in the wedding dress I was supposed to be wearing, with my fiancé Marcus waiting for her at the altar where he should have been waiting for me, I realized that the $3 million I'd quietly spent acquiring his struggling tech company 3 weeks earlier was about to become the best investment of my life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Chen, and until 20 minutes ago, I was supposed to be getting married to the man I'd loved for 4 years in the most beautiful wedding my family's vineyard in Napa Valley had ever hosted. Instead, I was hiding behind the ancient oak tree that had shaded my childhood tea parties, watching my entire world implode in real time, while 300 guests whispered in shocked confusion. The morning had started like every bride's dream. I'd woken up at dawn in the guest cottage where I'd been staying to preserve the tradition of not seeing Marcus before the ceremony, surrounded by my bridesmaids and the soft golden light that made our family's vineyard look like something from a fairy tale. My mother, Elena Chen, had been bustling around with the wedding coordinator, ensuring every detail was perfect for what she kept calling the social event of the season. Chen Family Vineyards wasn't just our business, it was our legacy. My great-grandfather had purchased the land in 1952 with money he'd saved working in the railroad camps, transforming barren hills into one of Napa's most respected wineries. 3 generations later, our Pinot Noir was served in Michelin-starred restaurants across the country, and our vineyard had become the dream wedding venue for California's elite. But for me, it had always been more than a business or a status symbol. It was home. Every vine, every building, every stone pathway held memories of growing up in a family that understood the value of patience, tradition, and building something that would last for generations. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was about to watch my own carefully planned future crumble in the very place that represented everything I believed about commitment and permanence. I'd been getting ready in the bridal suite, a converted barn that overlooked the ceremony site, when my maid of honor Jessica had burst through the door with an expression I'd never seen before. Part panic, part fury, and something else that I couldn't quite identify but that made my stomach drop before she'd even spoken. "Victoria, we need to talk," she'd said, her voice tight with an emotion that didn't belong in a room full of champagne and laughter and the excited chatter of women preparing for the happiest day of my life. "Can it wait?" I'd asked, turning from the antique mirror where I'd been adjusting my grandmother's pearl earrings. "The ceremony starts in 30 minutes, and I still need to put on my dress." Jessica had looked at the other bridesmaids, my cousins Amy and Sophia, and they'd exchanged glances that made my heart start beating faster. "Everyone else needs to leave," Jessica had said quietly. "Now." The room had emptied quickly, leaving just Jessica and me in the sudden silence that felt heavy with unspoken dread. She'd closed the door and leaned against it, as if she was blocking an escape route, though at the time I hadn't understood why anyone would need to escape from what should have been the most joyful morning of my life. "Sit down," Jessica had said, gesturing to the vintage velvet chair that had been placed by the window specifically for moments like this, where the bride could look out over her ceremony site and feel the anticipation building. "You're scaring me," I'd said, but I'd sat down anyway, my hands smoothing the silk robe I was wearing over my wedding lingerie. Everything had been chosen so carefully, from the something old pearls that had belonged to my grandmother to the something blue garter that Marcus had playfully insisted on picking out himself. Jessica had knelt in front of me, taking my hands in hers, and I'd known before she spoke that whatever she was about to tell me would change everything. "I saw Cassandra this morning," she'd said. She was coming out of Marcus's room at the hotel. The words had hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Cassandra, my sister, who was supposed to be in San Francisco finishing her last semester of law school. Cassandra, who had called me just yesterday to say she was so sorry she couldn't make it to the wedding because of a crucial exam she couldn't reschedule. Cassandra, who had been my maid of honor before Jessica, until she dropped out of the wedding party 6 months ago, claiming law school was too demanding for her to take on the responsibilities. "That's impossible," I'd said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "She's not even here, she's in San Francisco. She has exams." But even as I'd said it, Pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving had started falling into place. The way Marcus had been distracted for the past few months, checking his phone constantly, and being vague about his whereabouts. The way Cassandra had seemed uncomfortable during our last few video calls, avoiding eye contact and cutting conversations short. The way she'd been so quick to back out of her maid of honor duties, claiming stress when she'd never backed down from anything in her life. "Victoria," Jessica had said gently, "she was wearing your dress." The words had hit me like a physical blow. My dress. The custom Vera Wang gown that had taken 8 months to design and create, with hand-sewn pearls and French lace that had cost more than most people's cars. The dress that had been hanging in the bridal suite all week, carefully guarded and protected, the centerpiece of a wedding that had taken 2 years to plan. How is that possible? I'd whispered. My dress is right here, hanging. But when I'd turned to look at the garment bag that had been hanging on the special hook the wedding coordinator had installed, I'd seen that it was gone. In its place was a note in my sister's handwriting that I'd somehow missed in the morning chaos. "I'm sorry, Vic. I know you'll understand someday. We never meant for this to happen, but love doesn't follow schedules or rules. By the time you read this, we'll be married. I hope you can forgive us. Nash C." I'd read the note 3 times before the words had made any sense, and even then, they'd felt like they belonged to someone else's life. This was the kind of thing that happened in soap operas or cautionary tales, not to Victoria Chen, who planned everything meticulously, who had built her entire adult life around creating stability and security, who had chosen Marcus specifically because he'd seemed like the most reliable, trustworthy man she'd ever met. "How long have you known?" I'd asked Jessica, my voice barely above a whisper. "I suspected something a few months ago," she'd admitted. "The way they looked at each other at your engagement party, the way he'd always ask about her when you were on the phone with family. But I thought I was imagining things. I thought I was being paranoid." The engagement party. I'd thought back to that night 6 months ago, when we'd celebrated at the vineyard with family and close friends. Marcus had been charming and attentive. Everything a perfect fiancé should be. But now, thinking back with this horrible new context, I could remember moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. The way he'd lingered when talking to Cassandra. The way she'd avoided being in photos with him. The way they'd both disappeared for nearly an hour, claiming separately that they'd been making phone calls. Where are they now? I'd asked, though part of me already knew the answer. "At the altar," Jessica had said. "Victoria, they're going through with it. They're having the wedding. Your wedding. With your guests, your flowers, your everything. They just replaced you." The audacity of it had been breathtaking. They hadn't just betrayed me. They'd stolen my entire wedding, down to the last detail. The months of planning, the deposits, the carefully coordinated.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Timeline, the menu tastings, the flower selections, the seating charts that had taken weeks to perfect. All of it was still happening, just without the bride it had been planned for. I'd stood up from the chair, my legs unsteady, and walked to the window that overlooked the ceremony site. From my vantage point in the bridal suite, I could see everything. The white chairs arranged in perfect rows, the altar decorated with white peonies and eucalyptus, the string quartet playing the prelude music I'd chosen. Guests were taking their seats, dressed in their finest clothes, expecting to witness the union of Victoria Chen and Marcus Walsh. Instead, they were about to witness something else entirely. "What do you want to do?" Jessica had asked. "We could stop this. We could tell everyone what's happening. We could." "No," I'd said, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "Let them have their moment." Because even as I'd stood there, watching the setup for what should have been my wedding, my mind had been racing through calculations that had nothing to do with hurt feelings or broken hearts. 3 weeks ago, I'd made a decision that had seemed like a romantic gesture at the time. Marcus's tech company, Walsh Digital Solutions, had been struggling with cash flow problems that he'd been too proud to discuss in detail. But I'd done my research, and I'd known exactly how much trouble he was in. So I'd quietly arranged to buy the company through a shell corporation I'd set up, paying enough to solve all his financial problems while maintaining my anonymity as the new owner. I'd planned to surprise him with the news during our honeymoon, imagining his joy and relief when he realized that his new wife had just secured his professional future. Now, watching him prepare to marry my sister in the wedding I'd paid for, wearing the dress I'd designed, I realized that my romantic gesture was about to become something much more powerful. Marcus Walsh had no idea that the woman he'd just betrayed now owned his entire livelihood. "Jessica," I'd said, turning away from the window, "I need you to do something for me. Anything. I need you to go down there and sit in the front row like nothing's wrong. I need you to be my eyes and ears for what happens next. What are you gonna do?" I'd looked around the bridal suite, at the champagne that would go unwasted, at the bouquet that had been assembled exactly to my specifications, at the life I'd built that was crumbling in real time. But instead of the devastation I should have felt, there was something else growing in its place, something cold and calculating, and absolutely certain. "I'm going to watch," I'd said, "and then I'm going to decide what comes next." The ceremony had started on schedule. From my hidden position behind the oak tree, I'd watched my family and friends take their seats, confusion evident on their faces as whispers rippled through the crowd. They'd been expecting to see me, the bride they'd come to celebrate, but instead there had been only empty confusion as the minutes ticked by without explanation. Then the music had changed to the processional march I'd chosen, and Cassandra had appeared at the back of the aisle. Even from my hiding spot, I could see the audible gasps from the guests as they realized what was happening. My sister, who was supposed to be in San Francisco, was walking down the aisle in my dress, carrying my bouquet, approaching my fiancé. But it was Marcus's expression that had told me everything I needed to know about the true scope of their betrayal. This wasn't a last-minute decision born of sudden passion. The look on his face as he watched Cassandra approach was one of deep relief, as if something that had been planned for months was finally coming to fruition. He'd known she was coming. They'd planned this together, coordinated this replacement, orchestrated the theft of my wedding day with the precision of a military operation. While I'd been agonizing over seating charts and menu selections, they'd been planning to use all my careful preparations for their own ceremony. The officiant, a family friend who had known me since childhood, had looked confused and uncomfortable as Cassandra reached the altar. I'd watched him lean toward Marcus, clearly asking questions that I couldn't hear from my distance. But Marcus had nodded confidently, and the ceremony had proceeded. "Dearly beloved," the officiant had begun, his voice carrying across the vineyard, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Marcus Walsh and Cassandra Chen." The sound of my sister's name paired with my fiancé's had hit me like a physical blow, but it had also crystallized something that had been building since Jessica's revelation. This wasn't just about a broken heart or a stolen wedding. This was about two people who had systematically deceived me, who had used my love and trust and resources to create their own happiness while destroying mine. But they'd made one critical miscalculation. They'd assumed that Victoria Chen, the woman who planned weddings down to the last napkin fold, who avoided confrontation, who always tried to see the best in people, would be too devastated to fight back effectively. They'd forgotten that Victoria Chen was also the granddaughter of a man who had built an empire from nothing, the daughter of parents who had turned a struggling vineyard into a multi-million-dollar operation, and a woman who had just spent 2 years building her own successful event planning business from the ground up. They'd forgotten that the Chen family didn't just plan beautiful weddings. We also knew how to plan beautiful revenge. As I'd watched my sister promise to love, honor, and cherish the man who had been making the same promises to me just 24 hours earlier, I'd pulled out my phone and opened the email app. The message I'd been planning to send Marcus during our honeymoon was still in my drafts folder, ready to be sent with a single touch. The subject line read, "Congratulations on your new ownership structure." The message contained a single attachment, the legal documents showing that Walsh Digital Solutions was now a wholly owned subsidiary of Chen Holdings, LLC. Marcus Walsh, as of 3 weeks ago, was no longer the owner of his own company. He was an employee, and I was his boss. My finger had hovered over the send button as I'd watched them exchange rings, The same rings Marcus and I had chosen together at the jewelry store downtown. The rings I'd paid for as my contribution to our wedding expenses. Even the symbols of their love had been funded by the woman they'd betrayed. But I hadn't sent the email. Not yet. Because the Chen family had taught me that patience was the most important ingredient in any recipe for success. Whether you were aging wine or planning the complete destruction of someone who had underestimated you. Instead, I'd taken photos. Lots of photos. Marcus's face as he kissed my sister. Cassandra's expression as she was pronounced Mrs. Walsh. The guests' confused but polite applause. The moment when they'd turned to face the crowd as husband and wife, both of them glowing with satisfaction at having pulled off what they clearly thought was the perfect crime. Every image was evidence. Every moment was documentation of the betrayal that I would use when the time came to remind them that actions have consequences, and that some people are much more dangerous when you underestimate them than when you treat them with the respect they deserve. The reception had proceeded exactly as I'd planned it, with one crucial difference. Instead of celebrating Marcus and Victoria Walsh, the guests were toasting Marcus and Cassandra Walsh. The band was playing the same playlist I'd spent months curating. The caterers were serving the menu I'd chosen after countless tastings. The photographer was capturing moments that should have belonged to me. From my hidden position, I'd watched my parents, Robert and Elena Chen, navigate the social minefield with the grace and dignity that had made them successful in both business and society. They'd smiled when appropriate, made polite conversation with confused guests, and given no indication that their world had just been turned upside down. But I'd known them well enough to see the steel beneath their polite facades. The Chen family did not forgive betrayal, and we never forgot who had wronged us. As the evening had progressed, I'd seen Marcus and Cassandra begin to relax into their stolen celebration. They'd danced to the song that was supposed to be our song, cut the cake that had been designed to my specifications, and accepted congratulations from guests who were still trying to understand what had happened. But I'd also noticed other things. The way some of the guests had left early, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The way the photographer had seemed reluctant to take certain shots. The way the caterers and wedding coordinator had looked confused and professionally embarrassed by the last-minute substitution. Most importantly, I'd noticed the way Marcus had kept checking his phone throughout the reception, his face growing increasingly tense as the evening wore on. I'd known what he was waiting for. He was expecting communication from his business partners, his clients, his investors. Monday morning was coming, and Walsh Digital Solutions had several major deals pending that required his immediate attention. What Marcus didn't know was that the company he was counting on to fund his new marriage was no longer his to control. The patents he'd developed, the client contracts he'd signed, the employees he'd hired, all of it now belonged to me. And he was about to discover that the woman he'd betrayed at the altar was now the person who controlled his entire professional future. As the reception had wound down and the newlyweds had prepared to leave for what I knew was supposed to be our honeymoon suite at the Auberge du Soleil, I'd finally emerged from my hiding place. Not to confront them, not to make a scene, but simply to be seen. I'd wanted them to know that I'd been there, that I'd witnessed their stolen moment, that the woman they'd betrayed was very much present and accounted for. Cassandra had seen me first, her face going pale as she'd realized that her sister had been watching from the shadows all along. She'd whispered something to Marcus, who had turned to look in my direction with an expression that had shifted from shock to something approaching fear. I'd smiled at them both, raised my champagne glass in a mock toast, and mouthed the words, "Congratulations." Then I'd turned and walked away, leaving them to wonder what exactly I knew and what I was planning to do about it. Because the truth was, I'd already done it. 3 weeks ago, when I'd signed the papers that made me the owner of Walsh Digital Solutions, I'd set in motion a sequence of events that would give me more power over Marcus's life than he'd ever had over mine. The wedding was over. The betrayal was complete. The guests had gone home with a story they'd be telling for years about the strangest wedding they'd ever attended. But the real story was just beginning. Because Marcus Walsh had no idea that he'd just married into a family that owned his entire future, and that the woman he'd left at the altar was now the person who would decide whether he had any future at all. The Chen family had built their empire on patience, strategy, and the understanding that sometimes the best revenge was not immediate, but inevitable. Marcus and Cassandra had started a game they thought they'd already won. They had no idea that the game was just beginning, and that they'd just handed all the power to the one player who knew how to use it. As I'd driven away from the vineyard that night, watching the lights of my stolen wedding fade in my rearview mirror, I'd finally sent the email. The subject line that would change everything: "Congratulations on your new ownership structure." By the time Marcus opened that message, he'd be legally bound to a marriage he'd built on betrayal, financially dependent on a company he no longer owned, and professionally answerable to the woman he'd thought he'd destroyed. The wedding might have been theirs, but the victory would be mine. And unlike their stolen moment at the altar, my triumph would last forever. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that usually filled me with energy and optimism. Today it felt like the universe was clearing the stage for what was about to unfold. I sat in my home office, surrounded by 3 computer monitors displaying different aspects of Marcus Walsh's professional life, watching his entire world begin to unravel in real time. The first indication that my email had been received came at exactly 8:47 a.m., when my phone started buzzing with missed calls from a number I recognized as Marcus's personal cell. I let it ring, then ring again. By the 4th call, I could picture him in his downtown San Francisco office, probably pacing behind the glass desk I'd helped him pick out last year, frantically trying to understand how the woman he'd betrayed 2 days ago had somehow gained control of everything he'd worked to build. I'd spent the weekend transforming myself from a devastated bride into something far more dangerous. While Marcus and Cassandra were presumably enjoying their stolen honeymoon at the resort I'd booked and paid for, I'd been conducting the most thorough investigation of my life. What I discovered had exceeded even my worst fears about the scope of their deception. The shell company I'd used to acquire Walsh Digital Solutions, Chen Holdings LLC, had given me access to far more than just ownership papers. As the new majority stakeholder, I now had legal access to all company records, financial statements, email communications, and employee files. What I'd found in those documents had painted a picture of betrayal that went back almost 2 years, not the few months I'd initially suspected. The first revelation had come from Marcus's company email account, which I now had administrative access to as the owner. Buried in his sent folder were hundreds of messages to Cassandra, dating back to 18 months before our wedding. They weren't just romantic exchanges between secret lovers. They were detailed planning sessions for a systematic campaign to extract maximum value from our relationship before discarding me entirely. The earliest messages had been careful and coded, discussing the situation and managing expectations and timeline optimization. But as I'd scrolled through months of correspondence, their language had become more explicit and more damning. Marcus had been providing Cassandra with detailed information about my finances, my trust fund distributions, my business connections, and my family's net worth. In return, she'd been advising him on investment strategies and legal structures that would protect his assets in the event of a divorce. They hadn't just been planning to steal my wedding, they'd been planning to steal my entire financial future. One particular email thread had made my blood run cold. From 6 months ago, when Cassandra had supposedly backed out of being my maid of honor due to law school pressures, the real conversation had been happening in Marcus's inbox. "I think it's time to start positioning for the exit strategy," Cassandra had written. "Victoria is too trusting to see what's coming, but we need to make sure everything is properly structured when we make our move. The last thing we need is a messy divorce that costs us half of everything we've worked to acquire." Marcus's response had been equally calculating. "Agreed. I've been gradually moving assets into accounts she doesn't know about. The company acquisition she's planning will actually work in our favor if we time this right. Let her buy it, then we'll have clean ownership transfer without any of her family's lawyers getting involved in the business side of things." They'd known about my plan to buy his company. Not only had they known, they'd encouraged it, seeing it as a way to legitimize their theft of my money while making it harder for me to recover assets after they disappeared together. What they hadn't anticipated was that my purchase would give me complete control over Marcus's professional life, turning their clever scheme into the weapon that would destroy them both. But the financial betrayal was only the beginning of what I'd discovered. The more I dug into Marcus's records, the more I'd realized that his entire relationship with me had been built on a foundation of lies so comprehensive that I wondered if I'd ever known the real Marcus Walsh at all. The company he'd claimed to have founded through his own hard work and innovation had actually been built using stolen intellectual property. Patents that he'd presented as his own original creations were actually modified versions of work that had been developed by former business partners, colleagues he'd systematically cheated and discredited before taking credit for their innovations. 3 different lawsuits had been settled quietly over the past 2 years, with Marcus paying out significant sums to former partners who'd discovered his theft too late to stop it but early enough to demand compensation. The legal fees and settlement costs were part of the cash flow problems that had made him vulnerable to my buyout offer, though he'd never mentioned the real reasons for his financial difficulties. I'd also found evidence of client fraud that went far beyond simple overcharging. Marcus had been billing multiple clients for the same work, delivering identical solutions while charging each company premium rates for supposedly custom development. He'd been using client resources to develop products that he then resold to their competitors, and he'd been systematically data mining his clients' systems to gather intelligence that he then sold to third parties. Walsh Digital Solutions wasn't just a struggling tech company. It was the hub of a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been flying under the radar through careful legal maneuvering and the kind of superficial charm that had fooled me for 4 years. The personal betrayal had been devastating. The professional criminality was going to be his downfall. But even with all the evidence of Marcus's systematic fraud, it was the messages between him and Cassandra about me personally that had transformed my hurt into something far more dangerous. They hadn't just been planning to steal my money and my wedding. They'd been actively sabotaging my own business and personal relationships to ensure that I'd be isolated and dependent when they finally made their move. My event planning company, Elegant Occasions, had been struggling for the past 6 months with a series of mysterious problems. Vendors had suddenly become unreliable, canceling contracts at the last minute and forcing me to scramble for replacements at premium rates. Key clients had abruptly decided to go with competitors, often after receiving anonymous tips about supposed problems with my service quality. I'd been losing money steadily, putting more pressure on my trust fund and making me more financially dependent on my relationship with Marcus. Now I knew why. Marcus had been systematically sabotaging my business relationships, using information I'd shared with him about upcoming events, client preferences, and vendor contracts to create problems that would drive customers away. He'd been posing as a concerned industry insider, warning my clients about fictitious issues, while simultaneously recommending competitors who were offering him kickbacks for the referrals. My own fiancé had been destroying my career from the inside, ensuring that I'd be too financially and professionally compromised to fight back effectively when he inevitably betrayed me. Every canceled contract, every lost client, every vendor who'd suddenly become unreliable had been part of a coordinated campaign to weaken me systematically. But Marcus had underestimated exactly who he was dealing with. The Chen family hadn't built their empire by giving up when things got difficult, and we certainly hadn't survived and thrived for 3 generations by allowing criminals to operate in our territory without consequences. I'd spent Sunday morning in a conference call with my father, my Uncle David, who ran our legal department, and our family's private investigator, a former FBI agent named Sarah Martinez, who specialized in corporate fraud. By the end of that call, we'd assembled a comprehensive strategy that would not only recover everything Marcus had stolen from me personally, but would also ensure that his entire criminal operation was exposed and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The first phase had already begun. As the new owner of Walsh Digital Solutions, I had immediately placed the company under comprehensive audit by our accounting firm, officially cited as routine due diligence following the ownership change. What appeared to be standard business practice was actually a forensic investigation that would document every aspect of Marcus's fraud for presentation to both civil and criminal courts. The second phase involved my business connections throughout Northern California's tech industry. The Chen family had relationships with major law firms, accounting agencies, and corporate investigation services throughout the region. By Sunday evening, I'd quietly alerted key players in the industry about potential fraud at Walsh Digital Solutions, ensuring that Marcus's criminal activities would be discovered independently by multiple sources, making it impossible for him to claim that my accusations were motivated by personal revenge. The third phase was more personal. Sarah Martinez had begun investigating Cassandra's role in the conspiracy, tracing her communications, her financial transactions, and her academic records at UC Law School. What we'd discovered had been even more damning than I'd expected. Cassandra hadn't just been Marcus's romantic partner and criminal accomplice. She'd been the strategic mastermind behind many of their schemes, using her legal training to structure their activities in ways that would be difficult to prosecute and easy to conceal. Her law school thesis had actually been about white-collar crime prosecution, giving her detailed knowledge of exactly how to commit financial fraud while minimizing legal exposure. The law school examination excuse that had kept her away from my wedding hadn't been real. There were no crucial exams during the weekend of our wedding. Cassandra had been in San Francisco that entire week, staying at a hotel 3 blocks from Marcus's office, coordinating the final details of their plan to steal my wedding and disappear with everything they'd systematically taken from me over the past 2 years. But the most damaging discovery had been the evidence that Cassandra had been planning to use her law degree for more than just advising Marcus on his fraud schemes. She'd been researching inheritance law, specifically focusing on situations where wealthy individuals died without clear estate planning. The insurance policies that Marcus had taken out on me weren't just standard life insurance. They were specifically structured to provide maximum benefit if I died within the first year of our marriage, before any prenuptial agreements could be modified or challenged. My sister and my fiancé hadn't just been planning to steal my wedding and my money. They'd been researching ways to kill me and make it look accidental. The realization had hit me like a physical blow, transforming what I'd thought was a story about romantic betrayal into something far more sinister. The hiking trips Marcus had suggested in remote areas where cell phone coverage was spotty. The sailing excursions he'd planned for conditions that were borderline dangerous. The skiing vacation where he'd encouraged me to try slopes that were beyond my skill level. All of it had been preparation for creating an accident that would eliminate the one person who could expose their crimes, while making them wealthy enough to disappear completely. But they'd made one critical error in their calculations. They'd assumed that Victoria Chen was just another trusting victim who could be manipulated and ultimately discarded. They'd forgotten that the Chen family had built their success on being smarter, more patient, and more ruthless than anyone who tried to take advantage of them. By Monday morning, I'd transformed from a heartbroken bride into something far more dangerous. I was a woman with unlimited resources, comprehensive evidence of systematic criminal activity, and a network of professional investigators and legal experts who specialized in destroying people like Marcus Walsh. The first call had come at 8:47 a.m., the second at 8:52. By 9:15, Marcus had left 3 voicemails, each one more panicked than the last. I'd listened to them all while reviewing the final reports from our weekend investigation, savoring the desperation in his voice, as he'd slowly realized that his carefully constructed criminal empire was crumbling around him. "Victoria, please call me back," his first message had said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "There's been some kind of mistake with the company paperwork. My lawyers are saying that Chen Holdings owns Walsh Digital Solutions now, but that's impossible. You would have told me if you were planning something like that. Please call me so we can sort this out." The second message had been less polite. "Victoria, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this needs to stop immediately. I've got clients and employees depending on this company, and whatever you think you're accomplishing with this corporate takeover nonsense is going to hurt innocent people. Call me back right now so we can resolve this like adults." The third message had revealed the true Marcus Walsh, the man behind the charming facade I'd fallen in love with 4 years ago. "You vindictive bitch," he'd snarled into the phone, his voice dripping with rage and contempt. "I don't know how you pulled this off, but you're not going to destroy everything I've built just because you're upset about the wedding. I'll fight you in court. I'll expose every dirty dealing your family has ever been involved in, and I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of vindictive psychopath you really are." That third message had been a gift. Marcus, threatening to expose my family's business dealings while simultaneously revealing his own knowledge of what he called dirty dealings, was evidence of his criminal mindset and his willingness to use extortion as a weapon. Our lawyers would have a field day with that recording. But Marcus wasn't the only one who'd been making phone calls that morning. At 9:30, my personal phone had rung with a number I recognized as Cassandra's cell. I'd answered on the 4th ring, adopting the same pleasant tone I'd used with her all our lives. "Hello, sister," I'd said, putting just enough emphasis on the word sister to let her know that I was fully aware of how completely she'd betrayed that relationship. "Victoria," Cassandra had said, her voice carefully controlled in the way she'd learned during law school when she needed to sound authoritative while hiding her actual emotions. "We need to talk." "Do we?" I'd asked, genuinely curious about what she thought she could possibly say that would make any of this better. "I thought you'd said everything you needed to say when you stole my wedding dress and married my fiancé." "It's not what you think," she'd said, falling back on the kind of generic denial that people always used when they'd been caught doing exactly what it looked like they were doing. "There are things you don't understand about Marcus, about your relationship, about why we had to do what we did." The phrase "had to do what we did" had been particularly interesting. Not what happened or what we chose to do, but what we had to do. As if stealing my wedding and planning my murder had been some kind of moral imperative rather than criminal conspiracy. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I'd said, my voice remaining pleasant while I'd opened the folder containing printed copies of their email correspondence. "I understand that you've been planning this for almost 2 years. I understand that you've been systematically sabotaging my business to make me financially dependent. I understand that you've been researching inheritance law and insurance fraud. I understand quite a lot more than you think I do." The silence on the other end of the line had been profound. I'd been able to hear Cassandra's breathing change as she'd realized that her sister wasn't just upset about a stolen wedding. I was armed with information that could destroy both of them completely. "How much do you know?" she'd finally asked, abandoning any pretense that this conversation was about misunderstandings or family reconciliation. "Everything," I'd said simply. "The question isn't what I know. The question is what I'm going to do about it." "Victoria, listen to me very carefully," Cassandra had said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she'd used during law school when she was trying to intimidate someone into backing down. "Whatever you think you've discovered, you need to consider the consequences of making it public. Marcus and I aren't the only ones who would be hurt if you start making accusations. Your family's business has secrets too, and some of them wouldn't survive public scrutiny." The threat had been both pathetic and revealing. Pathetic, because Cassandra clearly had no idea that the Chen family's business dealings were completely legitimate and regularly audited by multiple agencies. Revealing because it showed that she'd been researching ways to attack my family if her crimes were ever exposed. "Are you threatening me?" I'd asked, genuinely amused by the audacity of someone who'd committed multiple felonies trying to intimidate the victim of those crimes. "I'm trying to protect all of us," she'd said. "But if you force our hand, if you try to destroy Marcus out of spite, you're going to discover that you're not as powerful as you think you are." "Sister," I'd said, letting my voice turn cold in a way that would have reminded her of our father when he was about to destroy a business competitor, "you're about to discover exactly how powerful I actually am." I'd hung up the phone and immediately forwarded a recording of the conversation to Sarah Martinez, who would add Cassandra's threats to the growing pile of evidence that would ensure both of them spent significant time in prison. But the most satisfying moment of the morning had come at 10:15, when Marcus had finally arrived at his office to discover that his keycard no longer worked. As the new owner of Walsh Digital Solutions, I'd exercised my right to review all personnel decisions, starting with the immediate suspension of Marcus Walsh pending a comprehensive investigation into financial irregularities within the company. I'd been sitting in my car across the street from his building, watching through binoculars as he'd tried repeatedly to badge into the office, becoming increasingly agitated as he'd realized that he'd been locked out of his own company. The security guard who'd finally approached him had been polite but firm. Mr. Walsh was no longer authorized to enter the building without an escort, and any personal belongings would need to be retrieved during scheduled appointments supervised by company security. Marcus had stood on the sidewalk for nearly 20 minutes, making phone calls that I'd known were going nowhere. His lawyers couldn't help him regain access to a company he no longer owned. His employees couldn't override security protocols that had been implemented by the new ownership. His business partners couldn't restore his authority within an organization that was now entirely under my control. For the first time since I'd discovered his betrayal, Marcus Walsh was completely powerless, and he knew it. But watching him pace helplessly outside his former office had only been the beginning of what I'd planned for that day. While Marcus had been discovering that he was no longer welcome in his own workplace, my team had been implementing the second phase of our strategy. Every major client of Walsh Digital Solutions had received a carefully worded letter explaining that the company was undergoing new management review and that all existing contracts would need to be renegotiated to ensure continued service quality. What the clients hadn't been told was that the review process would expose all of Marcus's fraudulent practices, giving them grounds to terminate their contracts immediately and demand refunds for services that had been billed but never actually provided. By the end of the week, Walsh Digital Solutions would have no clients, no revenue, and no prospects for future business. The third phase had involved Marcus's employees, most of whom were honest professionals who had no idea they'd been working for a criminal enterprise. I had arranged for each of them to receive confidential interviews with our investigators, giving them opportunities to report any suspicious activities they'd witnessed, while ensuring they wouldn't face prosecution for crimes they hadn't knowingly committed. What had emerged from those interviews had been a picture of systematic employee exploitation that added labor law violations to the growing list of charges Marcus would face. He'd been stealing credit for work done by his staff, billing clients premium rates for junior-level contributions, and threatening employees with career sabotage if they complained about working conditions or tried to seek employment elsewhere. By Tuesday morning, 3 of his most talented developers had accepted job offers with Chen Holdings subsidiaries, taking their specialized knowledge with them and leaving Marcus with an empty office and no one qualified to maintain the systems his remaining clients depended on. But the most devastating blow had come when our financial investigation had uncovered Marcus's hidden cryptocurrency accounts, where he'd been storing the proceeds from his various fraud schemes. As the owner of Walsh Digital Solutions, I'd had legal authority to freeze any company assets that might have been acquired through illegal activities. Within 24 hours, Marcus had gone from believing himself financially secure to discovering that every bank account, every investment, and every digital asset he'd accumulated through fraud was now under legal seizure. The man who'd thought he was stealing my financial future had lost his own completely. Wednesday had brought the news I'd been waiting for. The FBI's Financial Crimes Division had opened a formal investigation into Walsh Digital Solutions, citing evidence of wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit theft. Cassandra had been named as a co-conspirator, and both of them were now facing federal charges that carried mandatory minimum sentences of 20 years in prison. The investigation I'd initiated through my business acquisition had uncovered a criminal network that extended far beyond Marcus's individual crimes. His activities had been connected to organized fraud rings operating throughout Northern California, making him valuable as a witness against larger criminal organizations, but also ensuring that any plea deal would require him to admit guilt for everything he'd done to me personally. Thursday morning had brought a knock on my door that I'd been expecting. Marcus had stood on my porch looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past week, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. The confident man who'd charmed me for 4 years had been replaced by someone who looked desperate and defeated. "May I come in?" he'd asked, his voice completely different from the arrogant threats he'd left on my voicemail earlier in the week. "No," I'd said pleasantly, "but we can talk right here. Victoria, I need you to understand that I never wanted to hurt you," he'd begun, falling back on the kind of manipulation that had worked on me for years. "Everything that happened, everything I did, it was because I was trapped in a situation that got out of control. I love you. I've always loved you. Cassandra was a mistake, but my feelings for you were real." I'd looked at this man who'd systematically stolen my money, sabotaged my business, planned my murder, and stolen my wedding, and I'd felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no hurt, no residual affection. Just cold satisfaction that everything he'd worked to build was crumbling around him. "Marcus," I'd said calmly, "in approximately 6 hours, federal agents are going to arrest you on charges that will put you in prison for the rest of your life. The only reason I'm telling you this is so you have time to decide whether you want to be arrested at home, at a lawyer's office, or wherever else you choose to spend your last few hours of freedom." The color had drained from his face as he'd realized that this wasn't a negotiation or an attempt at reconciliation. This was me informing him that his life as he'd known it was officially over. "You can't do this," he'd said, his voice breaking. "I can make this right. I can pay back the money, I can dissolve the marriage to Cassandra, I can give you everything you want. Just please don't destroy me completely." "You destroyed yourself," I'd said. I'm just making sure everyone knows about it." Marcus had left without another word, and I'd watched him drive away knowing that it was the last time I'd see him as a free man. The arrests had happened exactly as I'd predicted. Marcus at his lawyer's office, where he'd gone to explore plea deal options that no longer existed. Cassandra at her law school, where federal agents had interrupted her constitutional law class to place her in handcuffs in front of her classmates and professors. The news coverage had been extensive and damaging, focusing on the wealthy law student and successful tech entrepreneur who'd built their romance on a foundation of systematic fraud and criminal conspiracy. Every detail of their elaborate scheme had been exposed, from the stolen wedding to the planned murder, making them symbols of how greed and entitlement could corrupt people who should have known better. But the most satisfying coverage had been the feature story about Chen Holdings' role in exposing the fraud. I'd been portrayed as a savvy businesswoman who'd used her resources and intelligence to uncover a criminal enterprise that had been operating under the radar for years, bringing justice to victims who might never have seen it otherwise. The woman Marcus had tried to destroy had become the hero of her own story, while the man who'd thought he was the mastermind had become nothing more than a cautionary tale about what happened when criminals underestimated their victims. As I'd sat in my office Friday morning, reading news coverage of their arraignment hearing where they'd both pled not guilty to charges that would certainly result in life sentences, I'd realized that the woman who'd hidden behind an oak tree 5 days earlier was gone forever. In her place was someone stronger, smarter, and absolutely certain that she would never again allow anyone to underestimate exactly what she was capable of when someone tried to destroy her. The wedding they'd stolen had lasted 1 day. The consequences of stealing it would last the rest of their lives, and I was just getting started. 6 months after Marcus and Cassandra's arrest, I stood in the boardroom of what had once been Walsh Digital Solutions, now officially renamed Chen Tech Innovations, addressing a room full of investors who had gathered to hear about our remarkable turnaround story. The company that Marcus had nearly destroyed through his criminal activities had been transformed into one of Northern California's most promising technology firms, and I was about to announce the acquisition deal that would make me one of the youngest tech executives in Silicon Valley history. The irony wasn't lost on me that the conference room where Marcus had once planned his fraudulent schemes was now the place where I was celebrating the legitimate success we'd built from the ashes of his criminal enterprise. Every piece of stolen intellectual property had been returned to its rightful owners. Every defrauded client had been compensated, and every employee who'd been exploited had received back pay plus bonuses that reflected their actual contributions to the company's success. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that Marcus Walsh and Cassandra Chen were sitting in federal holding cells, awaiting sentencing hearings that would determine exactly how many decades they'd spend in prison for their crimes. The plea negotiations had collapsed when prosecutors had discovered the full extent of their criminal network, including connections to organized fraud rings that had been operating across multiple states for over a decade. The investigation my company acquisition had triggered had ultimately led to the arrest of 47 individuals involved in various schemes, ranging from identity theft to money laundering to conspiracy to commit murder. Marcus and Cassandra weren't just facing charges for what they'd done to me. They were facing federal racketeering charges that carried life sentences without the possibility of parole. The transformation of my own life had been equally dramatic. The event planning business that Marcus had systematically sabotaged was now thriving beyond anything I'd ever imagined possible. Elegant Occasions had become the premier wedding and corporate event company in Northern California, with a waiting list that extended 18 months into the future, and celebrity clients who paid premium rates for the kind of flawless execution that had made my name synonymous with perfection in the industry. The irony that my reputation had been built partly on the spectacular failure of my own wedding wasn't lost on my clients. If anything, it had enhanced my credibility. Brides wanted to hire the woman who had turned the worst day of her life into a triumph of strategic planning and perfect execution. Corporate clients wanted the executive who had uncovered and exposed a multi-million-dollar fraud ring through careful investigation and methodical evidence gathering. But success in business had been only one aspect of my transformation. The woman who had hidden behind an oak tree, watching her sister steal her wedding, had evolved into someone who commanded respect in boardrooms, courtrooms, and social circles throughout California. The Chen family name, already respected in the wine industry, had become associated with integrity, intelligence, and the kind of quiet power that came from always being underestimated by people who learned too late exactly who they were dealing with. The morning of Marcus's sentencing hearing had arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that made Napa Valley famous. I dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a tailored black suit that projected authority without appearing vindictive, and had driven to the federal courthouse in San Francisco with the same methodical preparation I'd brought to every aspect of this case. The courtroom had been packed with reporters, victims of Marcus's various schemes, and law enforcement officials who had worked on the investigation. Marcus himself had looked almost unrecognizable from the confident man who had once charmed his way into my life and my family's business. 6 months in federal custody had aged him dramatically, and the expensive suits and perfect grooming that had been part of his manipulative persona had been replaced by the standard orange jumpsuit of someone awaiting sentencing for federal crimes. Cassandra had looked equally diminished, her law school confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone who had thrown away a promising career for a criminal conspiracy that had ultimately destroyed everything she'd claimed to want. The sister who had once been my closest confidant and biggest supporter had become a stranger whose betrayal had been so complete that I felt nothing but cold satisfaction watching her face the consequences of her choices. The prosecutor's opening statement had laid out the full scope of their crimes with the kind of methodical precision that made it impossible for anyone in the courtroom to see Marcus and Cassandra as anything other than predators who had systematically destroyed innocent lives for personal gain. 14 separate victims had testified about losing life savings, businesses, and in some cases their faith in humanity itself because of schemes orchestrated by the defendants. When my turn had come to address the court, I'd walked to the podium with the same steady confidence I'd developed over the past 6 months of transforming myself from victim to victor. The statement I'd prepared had been carefully crafted to focus not on personal revenge, but on the broader impact of white-collar crime and the importance of holding criminals accountable, regardless of their social status or apparent respectability. Your Honor, I'd begun, looking directly at Marcus as I spoke. The defendants didn't just steal money or property. They stole trust, security, and faith in the basic human decency that allows our society to function. Marcus Walsh spent 4 years systematically lying to me about every aspect of his character, his business, and his intentions, while my sister Cassandra used her legal education to help him structure those lies in ways that would maximize the damage they could inflict. I'd paused, letting my words sink in while Marcus had avoided eye contact and Cassandra had stared at her hands. But their greatest mistake was assuming that their victims would be too broken, too isolated, or too intimidated to fight back effectively. They forgot that some people have resources, connections, and the determination to ensure that criminals face consequences for their actions, regardless of how charming or convincing they might appear to be. The victim impact statements had continued for nearly 3 hours, with person after person describing how Marcus's schemes had destroyed their financial security, their businesses, and their personal relationships. The pattern had been consistent across all of his crimes. He'd targeted successful, trusting individuals, gained access to their resources through romantic or business relationships, and then systematically extracted everything of value before disappearing to start the process again with new victims. The cumulative impact had been staggering. Over the course of his criminal career, Marcus had stolen more than $12 million, destroyed dozens of businesses, and left a trail of bankruptcies, divorces, and in 3 cases, suicide attempts, by victims who had blamed themselves for being foolish enough to trust him. But it had been the evidence of planned violence that had sealed his fate. The insurance policies, the research into accident scenarios, and the detailed planning documents that showed he'd been preparing to murder me for financial gain had elevated his charges from fraud to conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. The fact that he'd recruited my own sister to help plan my death had made the betrayal particularly heinous in the eyes of both the law and public opinion. When the judge had finally announced the sentences, the courtroom had been completely silent. Marcus Walsh had received life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years for the fraud charges that would run consecutively. Even if he somehow managed to appeal the murder conspiracy charges, he would die in prison for the financial crimes alone. Cassandra's sentence had been slightly less severe, 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole after serving the full 25 years, if she demonstrated exceptional rehabilitation and cooperation with ongoing investigations into the criminal networks they'd been part of. At 26 years old, she would be 51 before she could even apply for parole, assuming she lived that long and managed to convince a parole board that she was no longer a danger to society. The moment the gavel had fallen, I'd felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction or relief, but a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice being served completely and thoroughly. The people who had tried to destroy me had been held accountable for their crimes, not just against me, but against everyone they'd ever victimized. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I'd been approached by dozens of reporters wanting to know how it felt to see my former fiancé and sister sentenced to life in prison. My response had been carefully prepared and deliberately focused on the broader implications rather than personal satisfaction. This case demonstrates that white-collar criminals often cause more lasting damage than violent criminals, I'd said, standing on the courthouse steps with the kind of confidence that came from knowing I'd used my resources and intelligence to protect future victims from predators who would never have another opportunity to destroy innocent lives. Marcus Walsh and Cassandra Chen will never again be able to manipulate, defraud, or plan violence against anyone. That protection for potential future victims is more important than any personal satisfaction I might feel about the outcome. The media coverage had been extensive and universally positive, focusing on how a betrayed bride had used her business acumen and family resources to expose a criminal enterprise that law enforcement had been unable to detect. I'd been portrayed as both a victim who had refused to remain powerless and a civic-minded citizen who had used her privilege responsibly to protect others from similar crimes. But the most meaningful coverage had come from the business press, which had focused on the remarkable transformation of Walsh Digital Solutions into Chen Tech Innovations. Under my leadership, the company had not only recovered from the damage caused by Marcus's criminal activities, but had become a model for ethical business practices and employee empowerment in the technology sector. Every patent that Marcus had stolen had been returned to its rightful owners, often accompanied by licensing agreements that allowed us to continue using the technology while providing fair compensation to the actual inventors. Every client who had been defrauded had received full restitution plus interest, along with improved services that exceeded what they'd originally contracted for. Every employee who had been exploited had received back pay, bonuses, and equity stakes that made them partners in the company's success, rather than just workers being taken advantage of by management. The result had been a corporate culture that attracted the best talent in the industry and generated the kind of innovation that came from people who felt valued, respected, and fairly compensated for their contributions. Within 6 months, we'd developed 3 breakthrough technologies that had attracted acquisition interest from major corporations, looking to integrate our solutions into their existing platforms. The acquisition deal I'd announced that morning had been the culmination of everything we'd built from the ruins of Marcus's criminal enterprise. Google had offered to purchase Chen Tech Innovations for $850 million, a valuation that reflected not just our technological assets but the value of our ethical reputation and employee retention rates, in an industry where talent was increasingly difficult to attract and maintain. But I'd negotiated terms that went beyond simple financial compensation. Every employee would receive equity payouts that would make them financially secure for life. Every client would receive continued service guarantees that protected them from any disruption during the transition. Every patent holder who had been victimized by Marcus would receive additional compensation from the acquisition proceeds, ensuring that the people who had suffered from his crimes ultimately benefited from the success we'd built on the foundation of accountability and ethical business practices. The personal satisfaction of turning Marcus's criminal enterprise into a legitimate success story that benefited everyone except the criminals themselves had been enhanced by the knowledge that my own life had been transformed in ways that went far beyond professional achievement. The event planning business that had been sabotaged had become more successful than I'd ever dreamed possible. The family relationships that had been damaged by Cassandra's betrayal had been strengthened by the way my parents, aunts, uncles, and cousins had rallied around me during the investigation and trial. Most importantly, I'd discovered aspects of my own character that I'd never known existed. The woman, who had always avoided confrontation, had become someone who could face down federal prosecutors, corporate executives, and hostile media interviews with complete confidence. The person who had always tried to see the best in people had learned to recognize manipulation and respond to it with strategic thinking, rather than emotional reaction. The transformation hadn't been without costs. Trusting new people had become more difficult, and romantic relationships had been complicated by the knowledge that my wealth and family connections made me an attractive target for people with ulterior motives. But those challenges had been offset by the deep satisfaction of knowing that I was no longer vulnerable to the kind of systematic deception that had nearly destroyed me. 3 months after the acquisition announcement, I'd received a letter from Marcus that had been forwarded through his attorney and carefully screened by prison officials. The letter had been pathetic in its attempts to portray himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control, claiming that he'd been manipulated by criminal associates and that his feelings for me had been genuine despite everything he'd done. The letter had also contained threats disguised as warnings, suggesting that other members of the criminal network he'd been part of might target me for revenge if I continued to cooperate with ongoing federal investigations. But those threats had only reinforced my determination to ensure that every aspect of their criminal enterprise was exposed and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I'd forwarded the letter immediately to the FBI agents who were still working on related cases, and Marcus had been charged with additional crimes for attempting to intimidate a federal witness. The threats had resulted in his transfer to a maximum security facility where he would spend the remainder of his life sentence in virtual isolation, with no possibility of communicating with anyone outside the prison system without complete monitoring by federal authorities. Cassandra had made no attempts to contact me, which was probably wise given that any communication from her would have been forwarded immediately to prosecutors who were still deciding whether to file additional charges related to her role in planning my murder. Her legal team had apparently advised her that her only hope for avoiding additional life sentences was to maintain complete silence and hope that her cooperation with ongoing investigations might eventually earn her some consideration for sentence reduction. But the real closure had come not from their punishments, but from the positive impact that exposing their crimes had generated. The investigation had led to the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen assets that had been returned to victims who had given up hope of ever seeing justice. The criminal network that had been operating for over a decade had been completely dismantled, with dozens of arrests and convictions that had protected countless potential future victims. My own story had become a case study in business schools and law enforcement training programs, demonstrating how victims of sophisticated white-collar crime could use legal resources and strategic thinking to not only seek justice for themselves, but to protect others from similar victimization. The Chen family's approach to the investigation had become a model for how wealthy families could use their resources responsibly to support law enforcement efforts against organized crime. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome had been the scholarship fund I'd established at UC Law School, specifically designed to support students who were committed to prosecuting white-collar crime and protecting vulnerable populations from financial predators. The Cassandra Chen Memorial Fund for Ethical Legal Practice had been named specifically to ensure that my sister's legacy would be associated with the importance of using legal education to protect people rather than to exploit them. Standing in my new office at Google's headquarters in Mountain View, looking out over Silicon Valley and thinking about everything that had happened since I'd discovered those first signs of Marcus's betrayal, I realized that the woman who had hidden behind an oak tree 2 years earlier was completely gone. In her place was someone who understood that real power came not from avoiding conflict, but from being prepared to win any conflict that was forced upon you. The wedding that Marcus and Cassandra had stolen had been the end of one chapter of my life, but it had also been the beginning of something far more significant. The woman they'd tried to destroy had become someone who could protect herself and others from people exactly like them, and who had the resources, knowledge, and determination to ensure that criminals faced consequences, regardless of how charming or convincing they might appear to be. 6 months later, I'd received notification that Marcus had died in prison, apparently from complications related to an illness that had gone untreated due to his status as a high-risk federal prisoner. The death had been investigated and ruled natural, though there had been speculation that other inmates had discovered his crimes against women and children and had decided to administer their own form of justice. I'd felt no satisfaction at the news of his death, only a quiet relief that he would never again have the opportunity to harm anyone. Cassandra had been transferred to a psychiatric facility after suffering what was described as a complete mental breakdown, brought on by the isolation and stress of life in federal prison. The sister who had once been my closest friend had essentially ceased to exist, replaced by someone whose mind had been broken by the consequences of her own choices. The final chapter of their story had been written not by me, but by the criminal justice system that had held them accountable for their crimes, and by their own inability to cope with the reality of facing consequences for their actions. I had simply been the catalyst that had started the process of accountability, using my resources and intelligence to ensure that justice was served completely and thoroughly. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that the most important lesson hadn't been about revenge or even justice. It had been about the importance of never allowing other people's actions to define your own possibilities. Marcus and Cassandra had tried to write a story where I was the victim who would be destroyed by their betrayal and criminal actions. Instead, I had written my own story, one where their betrayal became the foundation for achievements that exceeded anything I had ever imagined possible. The woman who had been left at the altar had become a successful technology executive, a respected businesswoman, and someone who had used her experience to protect others from similar victimization. The wedding they had stolen had lasted one day. The success I had built from their betrayal would last the rest of my life, and the impact of holding them accountable would protect future victims for generations to come. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply becoming so successful that your enemies become footnotes in the story of your triumph, remembered only as examples of what happens when people underestimate exactly what you're capable of when they try to destroy you. The Chen family had built their legacy on patience, strategy, and the understanding that success was the best response to any challenge. Marcus Walsh and Cassandra Chen had provided me with the ultimate challenge, and I had responded by building a success story that would stand as a permanent reminder that some people are much more dangerous when you betray them than when you treat them with the respect they deserve. As I prepared to leave California for my new position as Google's Director of Ethical Technology Development, a role that had been created specifically to leverage my experience in identifying and preventing corporate fraud, I realized that every aspect of my life had been transformed by the events that had started with finding my sister in my wedding dress. The event planning business I'd built would continue under the management of employees who had become partners in its success. The vineyard that had been the site of my stolen wedding would host celebrations for couples who understood the value of commitment and honesty. The technology company that had been built on Marcus's crimes would continue operating under new ownership, providing ethical employment and innovative solutions for clients who valued integrity over profit. But the most important transformation had been personal. The woman who had once defined herself through her relationships with others had become someone who understood that real security came from building something that belonged entirely to herself, something that could never be stolen or manipulated or used against her by people who confused kindness with weakness. Marcus Walsh and Cassandra Chen had thought they were destroying Victoria Chen when they stole her wedding and planned her murder. Instead, they had created someone infinitely more powerful than the person they had tried to eliminate. Someone who would spend the rest of her life ensuring that people like them faced consequences for their actions. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.